Chapter 7. Professor Bob Flynn. As far as Albert was concerned, Bob Flynn had always been an average, vanilla variety dad. Bob spent 8 hours a day delivering mail. On weekends, he read books and fought a losing battle with Pat for the best recliner in the house. Did it get more average than that? Bob Flynn could not be spending his days in the Corps, miles under the surface of the earth, in a place that shouldn't even exist. Yet here he was, standing behind a desk, staring at Albert with a look of satisfaction on his face. Dad? Albert asked for the second time, because even though his dad was standing right in front of him, Albert just couldn't believe it was true. I knew you'd make it, Professor Flynn said, looking right at Albert. They were nearly identical versions of each other, Professor Flynn the larger, Albert the smaller, down to the 3 large freckles on each of their noses. Mr. Jones, Miss Howe, Albert's dad said, clearly pleased to see them too. He waved them all over to his desk, where 3 chairs sat open and waiting. Have a seat. I'm sure you're all exhausted. Getting down here the first time is quite an experience, but you'll get used to it. For a moment, Albert wondered if all this was a strange vision from eating that bite of stale fruitcake back at the Herman post office. But he took his place in the middle chair, Leroy and Bertie on either side of him. Trey stepped into the office too. I delivered the letter, Albert said, once they were all settled. Farnsworth barked and looked up at Albert as if he was owed something. Farnsworth helped, Albert added. And by the way, did you know this dog has flashlight eyes? His dad's laughter echoed off the stone walls. The stone only drove it home further that there was a lot about his dad Albert didn't know. I had no doubt you'd deliver that letter to the Pathhinder, Albert's dad said. And yes, I know about Farnsworth. He's a Canis luminatus, a rare breed. He glanced up at Trey, who was dutifully standing beside the desk. Alphen had returned to his shoulder. There are those who didn't think you'd get the job done, Albert's dad continued. But I knew you would. You're a Flynn. You were made for this. Trey's face reddened with embarrassment, as if he had been one of the naysayers. You all did well by arriving at the Pathhinder's tree, Professor Flynn said, glancing at each one of them in turn. The Pathhinder's location is the only way into the Corps. It's the train station, if you will. You came from different places, some farther than others, but once you reached the Pathhinder, you were at the outer gate of the Corps. From there, it's 12 miles down and a mile to the east. Very few people know about this place, and the ones who do, keep it a secret. You should already feel proud to be here. Albert did feel proud, but he was still having trouble believing the man in the green jacket was his dad. All this time, he thought his dad was Bob Flynn, postman. And now he was Bob Flynn. Well, Albert didn't know what his dad was. Albert's face must have given away his thoughts, because his dad piped up. Yes, Albert, it's been hard to keep it a secret all these years. He smiled at the 3 of them, but it was necessary. A balance keeper should never discover the Corps until it is his or her time. We keep hearing about balance keepers, but what is a balance keeper? Leroy asked, leaning forward and placing his pointy elbows on Professor Flynn's desk. And is my dad here? Yeah, what about my parents? Bertie chimed in. Professor Flynn raised an eyebrow. I'm glad you asked. Leroy, it was your father who was a balance keeper long ago. He and I were in the same unit. He chose to go back home after many noble years of service here. Leroy leaned in even farther. So he knows I'm here? Oh, yes, Professor Flynn answered. If you ever reach the status of professor, and that's a very, very big if, then you never forget, even if you leave and don't come back. A Corps professor never loses the memory of his or her experience here. Not so with everyone else. The memory wipers take care of that. Your father, Leroy, was a professor, but he won't be joining you. Then he turned to Bertie. Miss Howe, your grandmother was the balance keeper in your family. Your grandmother was quite a woman, very brave and strong-willed, though she had a quick punch when her temper flared up. I hardly knew her, Bertie nodded, but my mom always said I was a lot like her. Won't my mom be looking for me? Your mother as well had the balance keeper gene, but she chose to stay on the surface and live a normal life as some do. She knows exactly where you are. I guess that's why she was the one who suggested I go in the woods and find some big ugly tree, Bertie said, running her hands through her ponytail. Professor Flynn nodded and shifted in his chair. As he did so, Albert caught a glimpse of a white tile on a black corded necklace hanging around his neck, just like he'd seen people wearing in the main chamber. But his dad cleared his throat and shifted again, and the tile disappeared under his green coat. In the Corps, Professor Flynn began, you 3 will become a team. You will function as a training unit and learn all the skills you need. This training will take time and perseverance. You must commit yourselves entirely to the task. To what task? Albert asked. You do realize how confusing this all is, don't you? Professor Flynn nodded knowingly. We find that it's best not to say too much at the outset. Trust me, it would only confuse you more. You'll learn best by doing, not by listening. You were all chosen for very important secret work, and it won't be long before you understand the Corps the way all the other units do. Professor Flynn paused and looked at three gawking faces before him, and then he continued on. That said, here are the basics. You'll be trained in the fine art of entering hidden underground realms and fixing problems. Here we call them imbalances, in order to keep the people on the surface of the planet safe. It's dangerous work, but if you take your training seriously, you'll be fine. Maybe even champions. What kind of imbalances? Leroy asked. Like the way a scale doesn't balance if you put more weight on one side than the other? He was chewing on his thumbnail, unable to look away from Professor Flynn. Albert's dad smiled like he'd just overheard a secret. In a way, yes, we clean up problems that plague the ecosystems in the realms. The core here leads us to these realms. The core is the gateway. Those three doors in the main chamber, Bertie said. She raised an eyebrow at Professor Flynn. Are those the gateways to the realms you're talking about? Smart girl, Professor Flynn said. Bertie smiled smugly. Suddenly, Professor Flynn waved over Trey, who had been standing in the shadows in silence, and whispered something into his ear. Albert very much wanted to know every word that passed between them. Here was his dad, a leader in some secret society, and Albert had never known. And here was this guy he didn't know, in on his dad's secrets. Who was Trey, anyway? A balance keeper, too? What about all those people in the main chamber? He'd seen hundreds of them, all ages, when they first entered the Corps. Surely not all those people, especially the old dude with the floor-length beard, could restore balance in the realms. Albert spoke up the second Trey returned to the shadows. So, is everyone in here one of these balance keeper people? They all work as one family to keep it all running, Albert's dad said. There are cooks, creature caretakers, core mechanics, professors, launderers, medical teams, and communication teams to monitor the world above. But balance keepers are like the totally elite, right? Bertie asked, her blue eyes wide. Albert's dad nodded. Balance keepers are the entire reason for the Corps. You give us all a reason to keep it running and keep it safe. He stopped for a moment, looking all three of them over. Albert sat as still as stone. Without the balance keepers to ensure the realm stayed balanced, his dad said, his eyes landing on Albert, the entire world would come to a dire end. His words sparked a thought in Albert's mind. Just this morning, he'd heard something on the radio about a plume of ash heading towards New York City. The ash clouds back home, Albert said. This place has something to do with that, doesn't it? Professor Flynn nodded his head. It's why we brought you here at this moment in time. It seems one of our realms may be heading toward imbalance. Albert thought of his family back in the city. He thought of the ash covering the streets, piling up so high it covered all the cabs. Is New York going to be destroyed? Professor Flynn smiled comfortingly, which surprised Albert and settled his stomach all at once. No, that's why we have balance keepers like you. That's why we train, for when things like this happen. So this realm, the imbalanced one, is right under New York? Bertie asked, crossing her arms. Well, the realms shift places. They could be in any place under the earth at any time. However, when a realm becomes imbalanced, it freezes in place. Right now, the Calderon realm is stopped under New York, yes, and it will stay there wreaking havoc on the city until balance is restored. And of course, Professor Flynn added, shrugging his broad shoulders, if it isn't solved, the problem will simply continue to grow, expanding from New York to nearby places and so on. I think I'm going to be sick, Leroy whined. Albert gave him an encouraging thumbs up. Professor Flynn turned back to the group. You were each born with the blood of a balance keeper. You have the power to go into these hidden realms, but this power must be unlocked. That will take time and practice. You three will live inside the core and train for every situation that you could come up in the three realms. Once you've trained in all three, you'll have the chance to become first unit balance keepers, officially in charge of keeping a specific realm in balance. But first things first, this term you'll just train for Calderon, which just happens to be the realm I oversee. Professor Flynn winked at Albert. Trey is my apprentice. He will do everything he can to help you along. Wait a second, Leroy said. Back up. We're supposed to stay here, like, overnight? How long? Bertie asked right after. You mean no more burrowing dinners alone with Pap? Albert asked, desperate for his dad to say yes. Professor Flynn nodded. You will remain here for the duration of the summer. You will live in the core. You'll eat, sleep, and train. The core will be your home. That is, if you choose to stay. The balance keeper must make the choice on his or her own. Bertie grinned. She looked back at the waterfall, then directly at Professor Lynn. I love it. If we stay, what happens next? Leroy asked. He still looked a little unsure. Albert looked at his dad, too. He was just as curious as Leroy was. Every balance keeper is given a tile, Professor Flynn said. He pulled out the tile Albert had caught a glimpse of so they could really see it. The black symbol on the tile was a strange cone-like shape, almost like a megaphone. And although Albert had no idea what its significance was, there was something about the tile that carried the ancient weight of importance. All three of them leaned in to get a better look. The tile will give you skills and powers you cannot possess in the world above. How does that sound? Like, I could get real-life ninja powers? Leroy asked excitedly, because I'm telling you, I'm destined to be a ninja. I want to punch a hole through a wall. Bertie clapped her hands together. Wait a second, Dad. You have a power? Albert asked, desperate to know what secret thing his dad could do. What if he was like a superhero? What is it? Professor Finn smiled sheepishly. I can speak the language of the core creatures. That is amazing. Bertie clapped her hands again. Never took Dad for an animal guy, but that's pretty sweet. I'm in, Albert nodded. So in. Leroy turned to Bertie and they nodded at each other. So am I, they said together. Albert looked at both Leroy and Bertie and saw how excited they were. This wasn't just about him. This was all about them, together. For once in his life, Albert was going to have real friends. The three of them were going to be a team. His dad was going to spend time with him and teach him how to do amazing things. And that, above everything else, made Albert happier than spending an entire summer in Herming, Wyoming.